that anti-Asian sentiment doesn't go away. Like when Vincent Chin is murdered because people think he's Japanese, but he's actually Chinese American in Detroit in the 1980s. Like there's a history of it, and I think it's a really great question. And Japanese Americans would say one of the reasons we do the Day of Remembrance is because that anti-Asian prejudice hasn't disappeared. It is still part of us. And I remember people would call COVID like the Kung flu, and like it seems like it's just kind of like a funny little offhanded thing, but it's an offhanded comment that draws on this history specifically. And so I think it's a great question. And there's no doubt that the connection between today and Japanese mass incarceration and the gentleman's agreement is a direct thread that is there, and we ought to think about. Like I tell my students, so I in my one survey class, we do discussion exams now, and I always tell them that you can think about history in two ways, broadly speaking. You can think about yourself as just a victim of history, right? That anti-Asian discrimination has always been part of American history, and it's inescapable. Like history can make you a victim, or history can make you like an advocate in the world. You can use that knowledge and those very connections that you're making between then and now to understand injustice and try to build a better world as a consequence.
Following World War II, was there still discrimination against members of that regiment, or did they prove their loyalty to the American?
Yeah, so you're talking. I could only like the feed is a little unclear, but you're talking about the 442nd and the way that they're treated. Yeah, it's a great question. There's a beautiful image. I think it's 1947 of President Truman meeting the group and kind of praising them for what they've done. So, in fact, the 442nd is a very highly regarded unit today. We don't talk a lot about how it was segregated and how that reflects maybe something less positive, but their achievements, I think, per person, they're the most highly awarded regiment in World War II, or nearly the most. They do some of the most brutal fighting up the spine of Italy. Like it's like what they do is like the absolute horror of war. And they are celebrated. There's a film that's made, I think 1950 or so, that kind of celebrates the 442nd. They become a real symbol. And in fact, it's interesting because by the 1950s, Japanese Americans are being called the model minority. There's this idea that they are kind of the non-white group that other non-white groups ought to model themselves after. Because by 1960 or so, Japanese Americans seem to be, not all of them, but seem to be thriving in society, like despite being thrown into concentration camps. That model minority idea is actually created by a journalist who's using it to criticize African Americans. His argument is, if Japanese Americans can get ahead, why haven't African Americans gotten ahead? So Japanese Americans always resist and reject the model minority stereotype, but it's kind of being applied to them. And the 442nd is definitely one of the reasons why. Right? The 442nd does achieve that objective that it set out to, kind of demonstrating that loyalty through their blood and sacrifice. So it's a great question, but it's not something that the wider society is talking about it, but not the Japanese American community. It's not really until the late 60s where the third generation of Japanese Americans in the country comes of age, the Sansei, and they go to college and they find out that their parents were thrown in these camps that their parents have never talked about. And so it's really the third generation that forces the conversation more broadly, both within and without the community, about the kind of the mistreatment and the tragedies of the war. So it's a very mixed story, but for the 442nd, definitely something that is widely celebrated.